The smell of burning hickory wood and roasting meat coated the back of my throat, thick and suffocating. A chorus of clinking crystal glasses and polite mocking laughter echoed across the manicured lawn. I stood completely alone at the edge of the patio, my fingers gripping the cold, damp plastic of my water cup so hard my knuckles ached. 16 years ago, I lost my home, my parents, and my own name to a fire I did not start. They erased me to build a perfect life for my younger sister. My left cheek burned in the summer heat, the tight, scarred skin near my jaw pulling as I forced my face away from the crowd. Getting an invitation to the Mercer family barbecue in the summer of 2024 had been a shock. I only agreed to attend because my therapist suggested I needed closure. I am 39 years old. I manage burning forests and coordinate rescue choppers as a regional incident commander for the Federal Disaster Response Agency. I handle chaos for a living. I make life and death decisions while standing in the ashes of destroyed homes. But stepping onto my parents' lake property made my chest tight and my palms sweat. I wore a light summer jacket despite the stifling heat, my loose dark hair carefully draped over the left side of my face to hide my history. The house looked exactly the same. The white paint was flawless, the lawn perfectly green, the illusion of a happy family fully intact. As I walked down the gravel path, conversations stopped. Neighbors and distant relatives stared at me like I was a ghost who had forgotten to stay buried. My sister Brooke glided across the grass in a pristine white sundress. She played the perfect host, holding a glass of champagne, greeting everyone with a radiant, practiced smile. When she saw me, her eyes hardened for a fraction of a second before she threw her arms around my neck in a tight, suffocating hug. Her perfume smelled like sweet vanilla and expensive secrets. She leaned in close, her lips brushing my ear. "Please do not make today about your face," Brooke whispered. The venom in her soft voice made my stomach drop, an old familiar sickness rushing through my veins. Before I could step away, a tall man walked up beside her. He had the sharp, disciplined posture of a military veteran, his shoulders broad, his eyes kind but distant. Brooke instantly softened her posture, wrapping her arm possessively around his waist. "Rachel, this is my husband, Ethan," Brooke said brightly, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Ethan, this is my older sister." Ethan extended a polite, firm hand. I took it, feeling the rough calluses on his palms. "It is nice to finally meet you," Ethan said. He looked right at me, completely unaware. My heart pounded against my ribs so hard, I thought it might break through my chest. Ethan was a former Navy SEAL and currently a civilian contractor for the disaster response system. He was also the man I pulled from a burning room 16 years ago. He did not know I was the one who saved him from the smoke and the flames. He did not know my professional name, Chief Rachel Kane, because I had only been promoted and transferred to his region 8 weeks ago. We had only communicated through dispatch radios and formal emails. To him, I was just Brooke's estranged, troubled sister, the sister who supposedly caused the tragedy that defined his life. I pulled my hand away, offering a tight, polite nod. I watched Ethan look at Brooke with genuine affection. It made me feel sick. Brooke had built her entire marriage, her social standing, and her perfect life on the story that she had dragged him out of the fire. The afternoon dragged on into a suffocating, unbearable heat. I stayed in the shadows near the garden, sipping warm water, counting the minutes until I could politely leave. I watched my mother, Diane, mingle with the country club wives, entirely ignoring my existence. My father, Kenneth, gave me one stern warning look from across the grill, silently demanding that I stay out of the way. I was a prop today, a living testament to their charity and forgiveness for inviting the family failure back into the fold. Around 4 o'clock, my mother clapped her hands, calling everyone to the center of the lawn for the annual family portrait. People shuffled together, laughing and arranging themselves on the steps of the patio. I hesitated, staying near the back, keeping my head tilted to let my hair shield my face. Brooke turned around and sighed loudly, making sure the entire crowd fell silent. "Rachel, maybe you should stand by the trees," Brooke said, pointing toward the deep shadows at the edge of the yard. "The scar ruins every picture." A heavy, awkward silence blanketed the yard. The lake breeze suddenly felt freezing. A few of Brooke's wealthy friends let out low, uncomfortable giggles. My father looked away. My mother adjusted her necklace. No one defended me. The heat under my jacket became unbearable, suffocating me just like the smoke had all those years ago. I had enough. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply turned around and started walking toward the gravel driveway. I just wanted the safety of my car. I wanted the quiet of my own life. I heard the sharp, aggressive click of Brooke's heels on the stone path behind me. "Do not walk away when I am talking to you," Brooke snapped. Before I could react, she grabbed my shoulder and spun me around. Brooke reached out and violently shoved my hair behind my ear, exposing the entire left side of my face to the glaring afternoon sunlight. The thick, jagged burn scar ran from my cheekbone down to my jawline, an ugly raised map of dead tissue. She dragged her manicured finger right over the sensitive skin, pressing hard enough to make me wince. "This is what happens when careless people play hero," Brooke announced, her voice carrying over the silent, staring crowd. "You ruined our lives once. I will not let you ruin my party." I tried to pull away, but a strong hand suddenly gripped Brooke's wrist and slapped her arm away from my face with incredible force. It was Ethan. His eyes were wide, completely dilated, fixed entirely on the bottom of my scar. Near my jawline, the burn formed a very distinct shape, a small, crooked half-anchor. It was the exact shape of the metal navy medal he had worn around his neck the night of the fire, the medal that had burned into my skin when I carried him through the blazing door. The sounds of the barbecue faded into nothing. The world seemed to stop spinning. Ethan stood frozen, his breath hitching, his chest heaved as he stared at the anchor mark on my face. I saw the exact moment the fog in his mind broke. I saw the memory of the heat, the smoke, and my voice telling him to hold my shoulder flash behind his eyes. "How dare you!" Brooke screamed, rubbing her red wrist, tears of fake outrage welling in her eyes. "Ethan, what is wrong with you?" Ethan ignored her. He did not even look at his wife. His gaze dropped from my scar down to my chest. During the struggle, my light jacket had shifted open. The heavy plastic lanyard I had forgotten to take off after my morning shift rested flat against my dark shirt. The bold white letters on the ID card clearly displayed my title, Chief Rachel Kane. Ethan blinked, his face turning pale as 16 years of lies began to crack and crumble around him. The woman he thought was a failure was the woman giving him orders in the field. The woman his wife hated was the woman who carried his burning body out of a dying house. He turned to his wife, his jaw clenched, his voice low, steady, and dangerous. "Apologize to my boss," Ethan said. Brooke opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She stared at him in absolute terror. Ethan looked back at my face, his eyes welling with sudden, horrifying realization. He stepped closer to me, his voice barely a whisper, yet loud enough to shatter my sister's perfect world. "That mark came from my father's medal," Ethan whispered. The heavy silence in the yard shattered into 1,000 pieces of a memory. The smell of barbecue smoke morphed into the choking scent of burning pie agegonstik. It was the summer of 2008. I was 23 years old and utterly invisible in my own family. While my parents entertained their wealthy friends on the sprawling front lawn, I was trapped in the suffocating heat of the kitchen. I wrangled bags of dripping ice, restocked paper towels, and kept the younger cousins from running out the broken back door. My mother always made sure I had a task. Busy hands kept me out of the family photographs. Around dusk, The screen door slammed open. Tyler Bennett, the neighbor boy who spent his summers racing jet skis, stumbled into the kitchen with a guest. The stranger was 22 years old, tall, and painfully out of place amidst the country club crowd. He wore a plain white shirt and looked completely exhausted. Hanging from his neck was a heavy metal medal shaped like an anchor. It caught the dim kitchen light for a brief second before he tucked it under his collar. Tyler clapped him on the back, calling him Ethan, and dragged him outside toward the noise and the liquor. Ethan did not even look at me. He had no reason to. I was just the hired help in my own home. We did not speak. We did not exchange a single glance. He was a stranger passing through a house that was about to burn to the ground. Outside by the lake, the party grew loud and careless. My 21-year-old sister Brooke held court on the stone patio. She swayed on her feet, holding a plastic cup of vodka in one hand and a handful of illegal sparklers in the other. Our father had strictly banned fireworks near the house. Dry summer winds had turned the overgrown brush and the decorative lemongrass near the propane tanks into perfect kindling. But Brooke never followed rules, and our mother only laughed when Brooke announced she was going to put on a private show. Standing by the kitchen window, I watched Brooke fumble with a lighter. Her friends cheered. The sparkler hissed to life, shooting bright white sparks over the dry grass. She spun in a clumsy circle, losing her balance. The burning stick slipped from her fingers. It bounced across the patio stones and landed directly under the rusted valve of the massive propane tank. The dry lemongrass ignited instantly. Flames shot up the side of the tank like a hungry animal. Brooke froze. The fire crackled, growing massive in a matter of seconds. Instead of shouting for help or warning the people inside, my sister dropped her cup, turned her back on the house, and ran into the darkness of the yard. Panic exploded in my chest. Thick black smoke began pouring through the cracks of the broken back door. The smell was toxic, burning the inside of my nose. People in the front of the house were screaming, but I heard a different sound coming from the enclosed back porch. Someone was violently choking. I grabbed a wet dish towel, pressed it over my mouth, and shoved my weight against the jammed wooden door. The heat hit me like a physical blow. The porch was completely pitch black, filled with blinding, suffocating smoke. The ceiling hissed as fire crawled across the wooden beams. Down on the floor, a body thrashed blindly against the wall. It was the stranger, Ethan. He was trapped in the corner, coughing so hard he could barely breathe. Sparks rained down on us like falling stars. I dropped to my knees, grabbing the collar of his shirt. He was heavy, disoriented, and fighting for air. "Hold my shoulder," I screamed over the roaring flames. He reached out blindly in the dark. His hand clamped down on my arm. As I hauled him upward, the thick chain around his neck caught onto the top button of my shirt. We stumbled forward together. Just as we reached the doorway, a massive blast of pressure blew out the patio windows. A wall of pure fire swept across the porch. The heat superheated the air in an instant. The heavy anchor metal tangled between us, glowed bright orange. The searing hot metal slammed flat against my left cheek. The pain was indescribable. It felt like a knife carving straight into my skull. I shrieked, the sound tearing my throat apart, but I did not let go of him. I pulled with every ounce of strength I had, dragging us both over the threshold just as the ceiling collapsed behind us. The chain snapped, the metal falling away, permanently leaving its mark on my skin. Everything after that was a blur of flashing red lights, high-pitched sirens, and the metallic taste of blood. I drifted in and out of consciousness on a stiff backboard. The ambulance engine hummed loudly. The sterile smell of iodine replaced the smoke. I turned my head slightly, my left eye swollen completely shut beneath a thick layer of medical gauze. On the stretcher next to me, Ethan lay pale and covered in soot. He was barely conscious, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. "Is he breathing?" I rasped. The paramedic nodded, pushing an oxygen mask over my face. I closed my eyes, relieved, but before the darkness pulled me under, the ambulance doors swung open. My mother climbed inside. She looked terrified, but not for me. Diane glanced at my bandaged face with cold calculation. Then she reached out and violently yanked the privacy curtain closed, cutting me off from Ethan. "Do not let him get confused," my mother told the paramedic, her voice trembling with a frantic, desperate lie. "Brooke saved him. My daughter Brooke pulled him out." The steady beep of a heart monitor was the first thing that broke through the darkness. Heavy layers of medical gauze wrapped tightly around the entire left side of my head. The raw skin beneath the bandages throbbed with a relentless burning ache. My throat felt like it was coated in shattered glass every time I took a breath. Opening my right eye, I stared at the sterile white ceiling of a hospital room. Muffled voices drifted through the crack in the heavy wooden door. "Rachel was alone in the kitchen," my mother said smoothly. Her tone lacked any trace of panic or grief. Diane sounded completely collected as she spoke to a man with a deep, authoritative voice. "She must have left a dish towel too close to the open stove," my mother continued. "It was a terrible accident." My chest seized. I tried to scream, but only a dry, pathetic rasp escaped my ruined vocal cords. They were blaming me. While I lay sedated and burned, my own family had constructed a perfect lie. Hours later, the door creaked open. Brooke slipped into the quiet room. Her pristine skin did not have a single scratch. She smelled of expensive floral soap, completely untouched by the smoke that still haunted my lungs. Gripping the metal rail of my hospital bed, she let out a quiet, practiced sob. "Please just let them tell this story," Brooke whispered. "If the truth gets out, I will lose my college scholarship. Ethan will hate me. Our whole family will fall apart. You have to save me, Rachel." Not a single apology crossed her lips. She did not ask about my burns or the horrific pain radiating through my face. My sister only cared about the consequences of her own reckless actions. 2 days later, my father walked into my recovery room holding a single sheet of paper. Kenneth carried himself with the rigid authority of a man who always controlled the narrative. He placed a black pen on the tray table and slid the typed document toward my good eye. "Sign this," my father ordered. Reading the words made my stomach twist into knots. It was a formal legal statement confessing to criminal negligence in the kitchen. Kenneth explained the cold, hard math of the situation. If I refused to take the blame, the insurance company would deny the massive property claim. The lake house would be lost. Brooke could face severe criminal charges for underage drinking and reckless endangerment. I shook my head, pushing the paper away with a trembling hand. I demanded to see Ethan. I needed to look the young man in the eyes and tell him the truth about who dragged him through the inferno. "Ethan does not want to see you," my father replied sharply. "He is traumatized. Brooke and your mother just gave him back his charred metal. Brooke is taking care of him now." The betrayal cut deeper than the physical burns. They were stealing my sacrifice and handing it to the person who started the fire. I refused to touch the pen. Kenneth leaned over the bed, his shadow blocking the fluorescent lights above me. His voice dropped into a terrifying, hollow whisper. "If you do not sign this paper today, I will tell the fire marshal you set the blaze on purpose," Kenneth stated. "I will tell them you were insanely jealous of your beautiful sister. The whole town knows how much you resent her. Who do you think they will believe?" Staring into my father's cold eyes, the horrifying reality finally settled over me. He was not protecting our family. He was sacrificing his eldest daughter to save his favorite child. I was entirely alone. I picked up the heavy black pen and signed away my reputation, my dignity, and my place in the family. Shortly after being discharged, I packed a single duffel bag and left the Mercer house forever. I moved into my grandmother's cramped apartment across the state. After she passed away, I legally changed my last name to Kane. Rachel Mercer died in the ashes of that lake house. Rachel Kane was born from the wreckage. I chose a career in federal disaster response for one simple reason. I swore I would never let another powerful family rewrite the facts of a tragedy while the victims were silenced. 16 years of calculated distance vanished the moment Ethan saw my face at the barbecue. Sitting in the driver's seat of my car outside the summer party in 2024, my hands shook violently against the leather steering wheel. The suffocating smell of roasted hickory meat still clung to my light jacket. I stared blindly at the gravel driveway, my chest heaving as I tried to regain control of my breathing. Brooke had tried to humiliate me again, but this time, the weapon she used had backfired. My cell phone buzzed loudly in the center console cup holder. The bright screen illuminated the dark interior of the car. A text message from an unknown number waited on the display. I reached out, my fingers tracing the cracked edge of my phone case before opening the notification. Chief Kane, this is Ethan Vale. I need to know what really happened that night. Heavy rain battered the windshield of my truck as I drove miles away from the lake. The rhythmic slapping of the wiper blades did little to calm the racing of my heart. I chose a forgotten diner sitting right on the county line. It was a decaying building, with flickering neon signs and a parking lot full of potholes. Brooke and her country club friends would never step foot in a place that smelled of stale grease and cheap bleach. This was neutral ground. This was safe. Pushing open the heavy glass door, a rusty bell chimed above my head. The diner was nearly empty. An older waitress wiped down a sticky vinyl counter without looking up. I walked straight to the back booth, sliding into the cracked red leather seat. Taking a slow breath, I ordered a black coffee and waited. My left hand instinctively rose, my fingertips hovering just over the uneven skin of my jawline. 10 minutes later, the diner bell chimed again. Ethan walked through the entrance. Rainwater dripped from his dark jacket, pooling on the faded linoleum floor. His broad shoulders carried a heavy, invisible weight. He scanned the room, his eyes locking onto my booth. Every step he took toward me felt incredibly loud. My stomach twisted. For 16 years, this man had slept next to the sister who destroyed my life. He had believed her tears. He had validated her lies. Now, he was sitting across from me, staring down at his damp hands. Silence stretched between us. It was a suffocating, quiet, thick with guilt and unspoken questions. Ethan reached inside his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box. The brass hinges looked old and heavily polished. He placed it carefully on the center of the scratched wooden table. "My father gave this to me before he passed," Ethan said softly. His voice carried a slight tremor. He unlatched the tiny brass hook and opened the lid. Resting on a bed of dark velvet was a heavy metal anchor. Half of the thick military metal was perfectly preserved. The other half was completely warped. The metal melted and twisted into a jagged, unnatural curve. Seeing the object in person stole the air from my lungs. My chest seized violently. I was suddenly 23 years old again, surrounded by roaring flames, feeling searing hot litis, numbing flesh. A phantom burning sensation radiated across my left cheek. I had to grip the edge of the table to stop my hands from shaking. Ethan slid a white paper napkin across the table. He picked up the damaged metal with extreme care and laid it flat on the thin paper. Then, he looked up at my face. He stared directly at the bottom of my scar, tracing the shape with his eyes. The melted edge of the anchor matched the twisted, jagged outline burned into my jaw perfectly. It was an exact, undeniable mold. "Brooke did not pull me out," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. "It was you." "She ran," I replied, my tone entirely flat. "She dropped the firework near the propane tanks, and she ran into the dark." Ethan closed his eyes. A look of absolute disgust washed over his face. He rubbed his temples, exhaling a long, shaky breath. "I married her because I thought we shared this profound trauma," Ethan muttered. "I built my entire life around a story she stole from you. Every anniversary of the fire, I held her while she cried about how scary it was to run into that house. I am not sitting here to fix your marriage," I stated coldly. Ethan opened his eyes, looking at me in surprise. "I do not care about your guilt," I continued, keeping my voice low and steady. "I do not care about the vows you made to my sister. You are a contractor in my region. That makes this a professional liability." But more importantly, Brooke crossed a line at the barbecue. She dragged my professional name into her fantasy. She defamed me in front of witnesses. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the cold reality of my words. I was not a victim seeking an apology. I was a federal incident commander dealing with a hostile threat. "What do you need me to do?" Ethan asked. "Keep the metal safe," I instructed. "Go home, act normal. Do not confront her again until I have every single piece of paper I need to bury her narrative." I slid out of the booth, leaving my coffee untouched. I walked out into the rain, feeling a strange, cold clarity washing over my mind. The emotional paralysis was gone. Brooke had relied on my silence for over a decade. She assumed I was still the terrified young girl who signed a fake confession in a hospital bed. She was severely mistaken. Sitting in the driver's seat of my truck, I pulled out my laptop. I connected to the secure cellular network. As a federal official dealing with emergency operations, I knew exactly how to navigate healthcare bureaucracy. I accessed the State Hospital Archive portal. I filled out the strict medical privacy forms, entering my social security number and my old legal name, Rachel Mercer. I requested an expedited digital delivery of my complete trauma file from the summer of 2008. Just as I hit submit, my cell phone vibrated violently against the center console. The screen lit up with a new message. It was a text from Brooke. "You always wanted my life. Now you want my husband too. Stay away from him, Rachel." A dry, humorless laugh escaped my lips. Brooke was entirely predictable. She was panicking. She thought this was a petty sibling rivalry over a man. She had no idea this was a calculated demolition of her entire existence. I took a screenshot of the message. I uploaded the image to a secure cloud folder labeled with her name. Every threat she sent was just another brick I would use to build her cage. The next morning, the hospital records department sent a secure, encrypted email. I sat at my home office desk, sipping a glass of cold water as the large digital file downloaded. The document contained dozens of scanned pages. The old paper records had been converted to grainy black and white images. I scrolled past the medication logs and the surgical release forms. My eyes scanned the dense medical jargon until I found the attending physician notes from the emergency room. The typed letters were faded, but the clinical description of my injuries was perfectly legible. Patient presents with severe third-degree contact burns to the left side of the face. Burn pattern is highly irregular, suggesting direct, prolonged contact with a superheated metal object. I kept reading. The next paragraph made my heart race. Patient suffers from significant smoke inhalation. Soot deposits in the upper respiratory tract indicate prolonged exposure to heavy, concentrated particulate matter. Injury profile is entirely consistent with a rescue operation performed through an exterior rear exit. I read the sentence 3 times. The doctor had noted the specific nature of my injuries. The soot pattern and the type of burn completely contradicted the story my family had forced me to sign. A kitchen fire starting from a dish towel would have produced a completely different type of smoke and heat exposure. The medical evidence proved I was outside, pulling someone through a burning exterior door. My family had buried this file. They knew the medical records did not match their lie, so they forced a signed confession to override the clinical evidence. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page, looking at the signatures. The attending physician had signed the document. Right below that, scribbled in messy blue ink, was a note confirming that a copy of this medical assessment had been handed over to the local authorities. The name printed next to the receiving signature caught my immediate attention. Frank Delaney. He was the county fire marshal in 2008. I remembered a tall man with a gray mustache standing in the hospital corridor, looking uncomfortable while my father spoke to him in hushed, aggressive tones. Frank Delaney was the man in charge of investigating the cause of the blaze. He was the one who ultimately signed the official report stating, "I left a towel on the stove." If Frank Delaney received this medical file, he knew my injuries did not match a kitchen fire. He knew the official report was a lie. My father had somehow pressured a sworn fire marshal into changing the origin of the blaze. I opened a new search tab. Finding retired county officials was incredibly simple with federal database access. Within 3 minutes, I located a residential address and a landline phone number for Frank Delaney. He still lived in the same county, occupying a small house near the Eastern Ridge. I picked up my phone and dialed the number. The line rang 4 times. I listened to the static humming in my ear, wondering if the old man would even pick up. Finally, a sharp click echoed through the speaker. A raspy, tired voice answered. "Hello, Frank Delaney," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "My name is Rachel Kane. 16 years ago, my legal name was Rachel Mercer. You investigated a fire at my family lake house." Dead silence followed. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound on the line was the faint noise of a television playing in the background of his house. I could hear his breathing change. It grew shallow, heavy, with sudden anxiety. The weight of a 16-year-old secret pressed down on the connection between us. "Mr. Delaney," I pressed firmly, "are you still there?" Frank let out a long, shuddering sigh. It was not the sound of a man who was surprised or confused. It was the sound of a man who had been waiting for a ghost to finally knock on his door. "I wondered," Frank whispered, his voice trembling with age and deep regret. "I always wondered when someone would finally come looking for the first report." Gray morning light filtered through the dense canopy of pine trees as my truck climbed the winding ridge road. Ethan followed a quarter-mile behind me in his own vehicle, keeping a cautious distance to avoid suspicion. Frank Delaney lived at the end of a dead-end gravel drive. His small wooden house sat surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted garden tools. Stepping out into the damp air, a chill ran down my spine. We walked up the wooden porch steps together. Wood groaned under our boots. Before my knuckles even touched the peeling white paint of the door, it swung inward. Frank Delaney stood in the narrow hallway. Time had not been kind to the former fire marshal. Deep lines carved into his pale face, and his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. His tired eyes immediately locked onto the left side of my jaw. He did not look at Ethan. Frank only looked at the scarred tissue he had helped condemn. "Come inside," Frank said, his voice raspy and thin. The living room smelled of stale coffee and old newspapers. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through dirty windows. Frank motioned toward a faded floral sofa. Ethan remained standing near the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, acting as a silent witness. Taking a seat on the edge of a worn armchair, I kept my posture completely rigid. "You found the hospital records," Frank stated, lowering himself into a rocking chair across from me. I knew they would surface eventually. Medical facts are hard to bury forever. "Your final report stated the fire originated in the kitchen," I replied, keeping my tone steady and completely devoid of emotion. "You wrote that a dish towel caught fire on an open stove. But the emergency room physician noted my burns came from a metal object, and my smoke exposure occurred at an exterior exit. You saw those medical notes 16 years ago." Frank rubbed his weathered hands over his face, letting out a long, trembling breath. "The kitchen was a fabrication," Frank admitted, staring down at the scuffed wooden floorboards. "When my team arrived at your parents' lake house, the structural damage told a very clear story. The fire started outside on the stone patio. We found melted plastic cups and the distinct chemical residue of commercial sparklers right next to the ruptured propane line. The burn pattern moved aggressively from the patio into the house, blowing out the rear doors. Hearing the confirmation out loud made my chest tighten. My family had known the truth from the very first hour. "Then why did you lie?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp with restrained anger. Frank slowly pushed himself out of the rocking chair and walked toward a locked metal filing cabinet in the corner of the room. Keys jingled in his trembling hands. He pulled open the heavy steel drawer and retrieved a yellowed manila envelope. "Kenneth Mercer hired a team of corporate lawyers before the embers were even cold," Frank explained, turning back toward us. "Your father had immense influence in this county. Those lawyers sat in my office and threatened to drag my department through a decade of litigation. They threatened my pension. They threatened my reputation." Frank placed the thick envelope on the coffee table and pushed it toward me. "My wife had just passed away from pancreatic cancer 2 weeks before that fire," Frank whispered, tears pooling in his faded eyes. I was exhausted. I was broken. I did not have the strength to fight a wealthy family determined to protect their golden child. So I let them write the narrative. I abandoned you, and I have lived with that cowardice every single day since. Reaching forward, my fingers brushed against the rough paper of the envelope. I pulled out a stack of photocopied pages. They were his original handwritten field notes from the night of the blaze. Detailed sketches showed the patio origin point. Hastily scribbled margins documented the firework debris. This was the raw, unedited truth. "There is something else," Frank said, pointing a shaking finger at the bottom of the first page. "When we process a major property claim, the entire case packet goes to the insurance company. That packet included the original emergency dispatch audio, the call your mother made from the lawn." My eyes widened slightly. I had never considered the emergency call. "The local dispatch center purges their servers every few years," Frank continued, "but insurance companies keep claim archives for decades. Somewhere in a corporate vault, a tape exists of your sister screaming about dropping that firework." A profound silence filled the dusty room. Ethan looked at me, a profound sickness settling over his features. The puzzle was finally complete. We thanked Frank, leaving the old man alone in his house of regrets. Driving back down the mountain, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. The caller identification displayed my father's number. I pulled over onto the muddy shoulder of the road and answered the call. Rachel Kenneth Mercer barked, his authoritative tone ringing loudly through the speaker. "Brooke is falling apart. She told us Ethan is acting strange and asking questions about the past. I do not know what kind of poison you are feeding her husband, but it ends today. You are destroying your sister." I stared out the rain-streaked windshield, feeling absolutely nothing for the man on the other end of the line. "No," I replied calmly. "I am simply returning what she gave me." I terminated the call before Kenneth could issue another threat. An hour later, I pulled into the driveway of my small suburban home. A sleek silver luxury sedan sat parked next to my mailbox. Diane Mercer stood on my front porch, holding a thick leather-bound photo album against her chest. Rain misted around her perfectly styled hair. As I walked up the concrete steps, my mother arranged her face into a mask of deep maternal sorrow. "Please let me inside," Diane pleaded, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. I unlocked the front door and left it open, allowing her to step into the entryway. I did not offer her a seat. I did not offer her a drink. Diane placed the heavy album on the console table and opened it to a picture of Brooke and Ethan on their wedding day. "Look at them," Diane whispered, wiping a single calculated tear from her cheek. "They have a beautiful life. Brooke has built a charity. She is a mother. If you drag up this old tragedy, she will lose her husband. She will lose her position on the charity board. She will lose everything. You survived, Rachel. Can you not just let this go?" My jaw tightened. My mother was standing in my home, begging me to protect the woman who had ruined my face and stolen my name. Brooke burned a house down, let me take the blame, and built a career on a fake rescue, I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the hallway walls. She is a fraud. Diane stepped closer, her eyes flashing with a sudden, desperate panic. You cannot prove anything, Diane hissed, dropping the sorrowful mother act completely. Frank Delaney is a senile old man. His notes mean nothing without the insurance file. And you will never get your hands on that case packet. We made sure that audio tape was buried deeply, because it should never be heard again. A sharp thrill of victory sparked in my chest. My mother had just made a fatal tactical error. She had confirmed the audio tape existed, and she confirmed Brooke incriminated herself on that recording. Diane realized her mistake a second too late. Her face drained of color. "Get out of my house," I ordered, pointing toward the open front door. Diane opened her mouth to argue, but the cold finality in my eyes silenced her. She grabbed her leather album and hurried out into the rain, looking over her shoulder like a hunted animal. Locking the door behind her, I walked straight to my home office. I opened my laptop and began drafting a formal legal request to the Regional Insurance Archive Board. As a federal official investigating a past emergency response discrepancy, I had the exact jurisdiction needed to pull a closed case packet. Before my fingers could finish typing the authorization code, a loud notification chime echoed from my cell phone. Lily, my younger cousin, had sent me an urgent text message containing a single web link. I clicked the blue text. A social media page opened on my screen. Brooke had just published a massive public post to her thousands of followers in the lake community. The title read, "My sister is trying to steal my trauma again." Below the bold text was a lengthy, agonizing paragraph detailing how her estranged, toxic sister had shown up at a family barbecue to harass her husband and cast doubt on her heroic rescue. Brooke claimed I was mentally unstable and obsessed with ruining her charity work. But the most damaging part was the photograph attached to the bottom of the post. It was a picture of me taken just weeks after I left the hospital 16 years ago. Brooke had cropped and manipulated the lighting, making my scarred face look terrifying and unhinged. Hundreds of comments were already pouring in. Neighbors and strangers were showering Brooke with sympathy, calling me a monster and demanding I be banned from the community. Brooke had launched a full-scale media war. She thought controlling the public narrative would force me back into the shadows. I leaned back in my desk chair, staring at her smiling profile picture, and picked up my phone to call my attorney. The glow from my cell phone screen illuminated the dark walls of my home office, flashing with an endless stream of notifications. Brooke had turned a family secret into a public execution. Reading the comments beneath her social media post made my stomach churn. People I had known since childhood were leaving vicious remarks. They called me a toxic sister, a jealous monster, and a danger to the community. Brooke had expertly weaponized her pristine reputation. She painted herself as the terrified victim facing a deranged sibling who wanted to steal her traumatic history. Reaching for the phone, I tapped the contact name for my younger cousin Lily. The line rang several times before a hesitant voice answered. "Rachel?" Lily whispered, her tone thick with anxiety. "My mother told me not to answer your calls. She said Uncle Kenneth is furious, and everyone needs to pick a side." "I am not asking you to fight my battles," I replied gently. "But you were holding your phone during the family picture at the barbecue. You were recording a video for your social media page when Brooke walked over to me. I just need you to send me that footage." A heavy sigh echoed through the speaker. "Brooke is terrifying when she is angry," Lily said. "If she finds out I helped you, she will turn the whole lake community against my family. I cannot afford to be her enemy." "You do not have to say a word," I assured her. "Just send the file. You know exactly what you saw her do to me." Lily remained silent for a long moment before quietly hanging up the phone. A wave of frustration washed over me. Without that video, The confrontation at the barbecue was just my word against a beloved local celebrity. The next morning, I drove into the city to meet with a trusted civil litigation attorney. Sarah Hayes was a former prosecutor who now handled high-stakes defamation cases. Sitting in her sleek glass office, I laid out the tangled history of the Lake House fire, the fake statement my father forced me to sign, and the sudden escalation at the barbecue. Sarah leaned back in her leather chair, tapping a gold pen against her legal pad. The original incident happened 16 years ago, Sarah explained. Filing criminal charges for a false police report or insurance fraud from 2008 will be incredibly difficult because the statute of limitations expired a decade ago. Your parents and your sister beat the clock on the fire. My jaw tightened. They had stolen my identity and gotten away with it simply by running out the timer. However, Sarah continued, a sharp gleam appearing in her eyes. Brooke made a massive mistake this week. By publicly declaring you were the arsonist in front of prominent community members at the barbecue, and by posting a manipulated photograph claiming you are harassing her, she committed textbook defamation. She is actively destroying your professional reputation as a federal incident commander right now. We can absolutely file a civil suit that will drain her bank accounts and force a public retraction, but we need hard proof of her malicious intent. Walking out of the law office, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The caller identification displayed Ethan. I answered, hearing the sound of passing highway traffic in the background. I moved into a motel on the interstate, Ethan announced, his voice rough and completely exhausted. I packed my bags and left the house this morning. I told Brooke I did not know who I was married to anymore. What did she say? I asked, gripping the steering wheel of my parked truck. She doubled down, Ethan muttered with a bitter laugh. When I asked her if she actually pulled me out of those flames, she started crying hysterically. She changed her story completely. She claimed she tried to save me, but you pushed her out of the way so you could steal the credit and look like a hero. She actually expects me to believe you intentionally burned your own face just to make her look bad. Brooke was a master at rewriting history. She would never admit defeat. She would simply twist the narrative until it fit her twisted victim mentality. I advised Ethan to stay at the motel and avoid any further contact with her. Returning home, I sat on my living room sofa, feeling a deep sense of dread. The audio tape from the old fire marshal case packet would take weeks to process through the insurance bureaucracy. The security footage from the Bennett family was still waiting to be digitized. I needed a weapon right now. A sharp chime broke the silence in the room. An email notification popped up on my laptop screen. The sender was Lily. There was no text in the body of the message, only a large attached video file. A surge of adrenaline rushed through my veins. I quickly downloaded the file and pressed play. The footage was incredibly clear. Lily had been standing just a few feet away, capturing the entire confrontation in high definition. The video showed Brooke stalking toward me on the edge of the patio. The audio picked up the aggressive click of her heels. It recorded Brooke violently, shoving my hair aside, exposing the jagged burn mark. Every vicious word echoed through my laptop speakers perfectly. This is what happens when careless people play hero. Then the camera captured Ethan lunging forward. His large hand forcefully slapped Brooke away from my face. The sheer terror in Brooke's eyes when Ethan demanded she apologize to his boss was permanently cemented in digital history. This was the undeniable proof Sarah Hayes needed. Brooke could not spin this. She assaulted me, mocked a disfiguring injury, and reiterated a damaging lie in front of federal contractors and wealthy donors. I immediately forwarded the video file to my attorney with a single sentence: draft the civil complaint. Just as the email sent, another alert flashed across my phone screen. Brooke was not hiding in shame after her husband walked out. She was escalating the war to a terrifying new level. The notification linked to the official social media page for Lake Safe Families, the prominent charity organization Brooke helped manage. A glossy digital flyer filled my screen, announcing a massive fundraising gala scheduled for this coming Saturday night at the country club. The bold, elegant text across the top of the flyer made my blood boil. It advertised the keynote speaker for the evening event, Brooke Vale, the woman who ran into fire. Below the title was a paragraph explaining that Brooke would be sharing her harrowing personal story of braving a burning building to save her future husband. She was actively using the trauma she caused to solicit thousands of dollars from wealthy community members. She was turning a moral failure into absolute financial fraud. Ethan called me again, sounding panicked. He had seen the exact same flyer online. "She is out of her mind," Ethan said, his voice shaking with disbelief. "She knows I left. She knows I remember the anchor medal. But she is still going to stand on a stage and tell 300 people that she saved my life. What do we do?" I stared at the glossy image of my sister smiling bravely on the charity poster. For 16 years, I had run away from crowds. I had hidden my face in the shadows. I had allowed my family to dictate when and where I was allowed to speak. That era was permanently over. "We do not stop her," I replied, my voice completely devoid of hesitation or fear. "Are you serious?" Ethan asked. "We are just going to let her lie to the entire board of directors?" I closed my laptop, a cold and calculated calmness settling over my mind. I had the medical files. I had the original fire marshal notes. I had the high-definition video from the BBQ. By Saturday night, I would have the rest of the puzzle. "Brooke wants an audience," I told Ethan. "She wants to perform, so we will let her speak. We will let her solicit every single donation under false pretenses. And when she is finished taking their money, we will introduce." Thursday morning brought a heavy brown package to my doorstep. The return address belonged to Frank Delaney. Inside rested a standard digital memory drive holding copies from his old case packet and the insurance archives. Plugging the small device into my laptop, my pulse hammered against my ribs. A single audio file sat in the main folder. It was not a fresh recording from a modern emergency center, but a compressed, scratchy archive from 2008. Taking a deep breath, I clicked play. Static hissed through my office speakers. The operator asked for the location of the emergency. Then, Brooke began speaking. Her 21-year-old voice sounded frantic and entirely sobered by terror. "I did not mean to drop it near the tank," Brooke screamed over the roaring background noise. The sparkler just slipped. A sharp scuffle followed. The phone must have dropped to the grass. "Brooke, stop talking right now," Diane yelled, her voice cutting through the panic with chilling precision. "The kitchen," Kenneth ordered immediately after. "When the firemen arrive, tell them the fire started in the kitchen." My hands trembled so violently that my coffee mug rattled against the desk. For 16 years, they convinced the world I was crazy. Listening to my own parents orchestrate the destruction of my life in real time felt like a physical blow to the chest. This was no longer just about a selfish sister, it was a calculated family conspiracy. Later that afternoon, Ethan met me at a small coffee shop downtown. We drove together to a modest brick house on the east side of the city. Claire Bennett opened the door with a welcoming smile. Her late father had lived next to the Mercer Lake property for decades. Claire led us to a cluttered home office filled with stacks of old media. My father kept analog cameras pointed at the boathouse because kids kept stealing his boat fuel, Claire explained, handing over another digital drive. When he passed away last year, I digitized all his old security tapes. We gathered around her desktop computer. Claire opened a grainy video file, time-stamped summer 2008. The camera angle was wide, showing the dark lake and the edge of our stone patio. The image quality was poor. Faces were impossible to identify, but the movement was undeniable. A figure wearing a light-colored sundress sprinted frantically away from the patio, just as a massive fireball erupted near the propane tanks. Seconds later, another figure, wearing a dark navy shirt, sprinted directly toward the blazing structure, plunging straight into the thick black smoke pouring out of the rear exit. Brooke wore a white sundress that night. I wore a navy blue work shirt. "Thank you," Ethan whispered, staring at the screen with a mixture of awe and profound sorrow. "You kept this safe for us." Friday morning arrived with an unexpected incoming call. My phone buzzed while sitting on the polished conference table in the office of Sarah Hayes. Ethan sat next to me, reviewing the final drafts of our civil complaint. The caller identification displayed my sister. Sarah raised an eyebrow and nodded. Pressing the green button, I activated the speakerphone function. "Rachel," Brooke snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "You are making a massive mistake." "Brooke," I replied calmly, "you are on speaker." "I do not care who is listening," Brooke continued, completely dropping her sweet public persona. "If you try to ruin my charity gala tomorrow, I will destroy you. I will tell the entire board that you are mentally unstable. I will tell everyone you are making up these vicious lies because you want to steal my husband. No one will believe a disfigured spinster over a loving mother." Sarah furiously scribbled notes on her legal pad. Ethan stared at the phone, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "Are you threatening me?" I asked. "I am promising you," Brooke spat back. "Stay away from my event." The line went dead. Brooke thought she was intimidating a lonely victim. Instead, she had just delivered a verbal threat in front of a federal contractor and a former prosecutor. "Well," Sarah said, setting down her gold pen, "that certainly establishes malicious intent. We have the insurance audio proving the cover-up. We have the digitized video showing the patio origin. We have the high-definition footage from the BBQ proving current defamation, and we now have 2 direct witnesses to her extortion attempt." Sarah compiled the documents into thick manila folders. She finalized the legal orders, the civil lawsuit drafts, and a massive evidence packet destined for the charity board of directors. "Tomorrow night," Sarah announced, handing me the heaviest folder, "we dismantle her." Returning home under the cover of darkness, exhaustion settled deep into my bones. The porch light flickered against the heavy rain falling from the night sky. As my boots stepped onto the wooden deck, a flash of white caught my attention. A plain, unmarked envelope rested directly under my welcome mat. Picking up the damp paper, a strange sense of dread washed over me. Nobody knew my home address, except for my employer and a few close contacts. Entering the warm hallway, I tore the seal open. A single sheet of folded paper slid into my hands. My breath caught in my throat. It was a photocopy of the fake legal statement I had signed in my hospital bed 16 years ago. The typed confession claiming I left a towel on the stove stared back at me. But there was something new on the paper. Written in the margin with blue ink was a note in my father's distinct handwriting. "If Rachel refuses," Kenneth had written, "threaten, intent." Someone inside the Mercer family circle had kept the darkest piece of evidence. Someone knew Kenneth had blackmailed his own daughter, and they had just handed me the final weapon to burn his empire to the ground. The drive to the country club felt like a march toward a final reckoning. Heavy rain pounded against the roof of Ethan's truck, washing the city streets into a blur of neon and shadows. We rode in absolute silence. The rhythmic slapping of the windshield wipers was the only sound inside the cab. I rested my hand on my small black evening bag, feeling the folded edge of the photocopied statement pressing through the thin silk fabric. 16 years of hiding and 16 years of swallowing the truth were about to end. When Ethan finally pulled the truck into the sprawling circular driveway of the event center, my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The heavy oak doors of the country club stood tall against the cool night air. The rain had washed the pavement clean, leaving a damp, earthy smell lingering over the manicured golf greens. Inside the massive building lay the absolute heart of the Lake community wealth. Tonight was the annual Lake Safe Families fundraising gala. It was the night my sister planned to cement her legacy as a local hero. Valets in crisp white shirts rushed to open car doors for men wearing tailored tuxedos and women dripping in expensive diamonds. I stepped out of the truck wearing a simple floor-length black evening gown. My dark hair was pulled tightly back into a low knot. For the first time in over a decade, my left cheek was completely exposed. The jagged, anchor-shaped burn scar caught the ambient glow of the parking lot lamps. I did not lower my head. I did not turn away when a passing wealthy couple stared openly at my jawline. The cold night breeze brushed against the damaged tissue, serving as a quiet, powerful reminder of exactly why we were here. Sarah Hayes walked on my right side, holding her heavy leather briefcase like a weapon. Ethan walked on my left. His jaw was set so tight a muscle twitched near his ear. Behind us trailed our small army of truth. Frank Delaney wore a faded suit that smelled faintly of mothballs. Claire Bennett clutched her oversized purse containing the digitized video files. My younger cousin Lily stayed near the back, looking terrified but resolute. We walked through the double doors and entered the grand foyer. Towering floral arrangements of white lilies and orchids scented the air, trying to mask the underlying atmosphere of greed and vanity. The sound of a live string quartet drifted from the main ballroom, mixing with the dull roar of 300 wealthy voices. The scent of roasted salmon and sweet vanilla perfume hung thick in the warm air. We moved as a single unit past the registration tables, ignoring the confused looks of the event staff. Passing through the arched entryway into the ballroom felt like stepping onto a battlefield. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over dozens of circular tables draped in pristine white linen. Waiters moved silently, pouring expensive champagne into delicate glass flutes. At the far end of the immense room, a massive wooden stage dominated the space. A bright digital projector beamed a towering image against the back wall. The slide displayed a photograph of Brooke standing in front of a brand new fire engine. Above her head hung a glossy banner with bold, elegant letters, "From Trauma to Courage." My eyes scanned the front row tables reserved for the charity board of directors and high-level donors. Diane and Kenneth Mercer sat right in the center. My mother wore a shimmering silver dress holding a crystal wine glass with perfectly manicured fingers. Kenneth laughed at a joke told by the bank president sitting next to him. They looked like royalty presiding over their kingdom, completely unaware that the castle was about to fall. Then Diane turned her head and saw us standing in the shadows at the back of the room. The crystal wine glass slipped right out of her hand. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into dozens of sharp pieces. Dark red wine splashed across the hem of her silver dress like fresh blood. Kenneth stopped laughing. He followed his wife as she stared in sheer terror toward the entryway. When his cold eyes locked onto mine, the color drained entirely from his face. He looked at the black briefcase in Sarah's hand and knew exactly what was coming. The string quartet stopped playing. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the program. A hushed silence fell over the wealthy crowd. Brooke walked onto the stage wearing a stunning emerald green silk dress that caught the spotlight perfectly. She looked radiant. She looked like the absolute picture of grace and survival. Approaching the wooden podium, she offered a humble, practiced smile to her wealthy audience. She adjusted the microphone, allowing a brief, poignant moment of silence to stretch across the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Brooke began, her voice echoing softly through the premium speaker system. "Looking out at all your faces fills my heart with so much gratitude. We are here to talk about safety. We are here to talk about community. But most importantly, we are here to talk about survival." The digital projector clicked, changing the image behind her to a picture of the charred remains of our old lake house. A collective, sympathetic sigh rippled through the audience. "That night changed everything I knew about the world," Brooke continued, pressing a delicate white tissue to the corner of her eye. "When the fire broke out, I was terrified. The heat was unbearable. The smoke blinded me. But then I realized my future husband was trapped inside." She paused, looking out over the crowd with wide, tear-filled eyes. She was a master performer, manipulating the emotions of every single millionaire in the room. Running back into those flames required a strength I never even knew I possessed, Brooke said, her voice trembling with manufactured trauma. Dragging Ethan out of that inferno cost us our home, but it gave us our future. True courage means facing the fire. It means choosing love over fear. And lately it has also meant choosing forgiveness. The projector clicked again. The screen now displayed an old high school photograph of me before the fire. The image had a slight dark filter over it, making me look brooding and distant. Recently, I had to face another kind of fire, Brooke told the crowd, adopting a tone of deep maternal sorrow. My estranged sister Rachel returned to our lives. She is a painful part of my past. The tragedy of that night left her deeply troubled. But I stand before you today choosing to forgive her. I choose to rise above the anger. Thunderous applause erupted from the front tables. The charity board members clapped loudly, wiping away their own tears. Brooke smiled humbly, soaking in their adoration and their open checkbooks. You did not save me. The deep booming voice cut through the applause like a thunderclap. The heavy acoustics of the ballroom amplified the absolute fury in the words. The clapping stopped instantly. 300 heads turned toward the center aisle. Ethan stepped forward, emerging from the shadows near the back doors. He walked slowly down the center of the room, his broad shoulders squared, his dark eyes fixed entirely on the woman standing at the podium. Brooke froze. Her practiced smile melted into a mask of pure shock. Her knuckles turned bone white as she gripped the edges of the wooden stand. Ethan, Brooke said, her voice shaking. She forced a nervous laugh, trying to maintain control of the room. Sweetheart, what are you doing back there? You are confused. Please sit down. My sister is manipulating your trauma. Brooke dropped a lit sparkler right next to the patio propane tanks, I announced, stepping out from behind Ethan and walking down the aisle by his side. She caused the fire. She ran away into the dark while her guests were trapped inside. I was the one who pulled Ethan out of the back porch, and we brought the proof. A massive wave of gasps and frantic whispers flooded the ballroom. Wealthy donors shifted in their chairs, looking back and forth between the stage and the aisle. At the front table, Kenneth Mercer stood up, his face purple with rage. Security, Kenneth shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. Get these people out of here right now. Nobody is leaving, Sarah Hayes stated, stepping into the light and raising her voice with the commanding authority of a former prosecutor. We have submitted formal evidence of charity fraud and public defamation to the state attorney. If anyone attempts to remove us, they will be listed as an accessory to the cover-up. The two security guards standing near the kitchen doors immediately stopped moving. Nobody in this room wanted to risk their own wealth by interfering with a federal investigation. Sarah walked over to the main audio-visual control board positioned along the side wall. The young technician sitting at the desk looked terrified. Sarah plugged a small digital audio player directly into the main sound system line. She pressed a single silver button. The scratchy, compressed audio from the old insurance archive blared through the massive ballroom speakers, drowning out every other noise. The frantic, terrified voice of a 21-year-old Brooke echoed across the crystal chandeliers. I did not mean to drop it near the tank, the recorded voice of my sister screamed over the roaring background noise of the fire. The sparkler just slipped. The sound of a phone dropping hit the speakers. Then Diane Mercer spoke, her voice sharp and incredibly cruel. Brooke, stop talking right now. Then Kenneth delivered the final blow on the recording. The kitchen. When the firemen arrive, tell them the fire started in the kitchen. The audio file ended, leaving a ringing, deafening silence in the room. The board of directors stared at Kenneth and Diane in absolute horror. The bank president, sitting next to my father, slowly stood up and moved 3 steps away from the table. Frank Delaney documented the patio origin point in his original field notes before my father threatened to destroy his career. I continued projecting my voice clearly so every single donor could hear the truth. Frank stepped forward, holding up the thick manila envelope. He looked directly at the board members, tears of 16 years of guilt shining in his eyes. Claire Bennett provided the digitized security footage from her father's boathouse, proving Brooke ran away from the flames while the house burned, I said, pointing toward Claire, who held up the digital drive. And Lily recorded Brooke mocking my burn scars and repeating her vicious lies just last week at the family barbecue. I finished placing my hand gently on my cousin's shoulder. Lily nodded bravely, holding her phone up for the crowd to see. Brooke backed away from the microphone, her chest heaving violently. The elegant, graceful victim facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked down at the faces of her wealthy friends and saw nothing but disgust. They were looking at a fraud. They were looking at a criminal who had conned them out of thousands of dollars. Pure, unadulterated hatred twisted my sister's beautiful features into something ugly and unrecognizable. She completely abandoned the script. "You were supposed to stay gone!" Brooke screamed, leaning over the podium and pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. Her voice was shrill and desperate, echoing horribly through the microphone. "Everyone was happier when you disappeared. We gave you a roof. We fed you. You were nothing. And you ruined our perfect family. You should have just stayed quiet, like you promised." She did not deny the audio recording. She did not claim she was innocent. She simply confessed her true motive, right in front of the entire charity board. Brooke did not care about the fire or the fraud or the people who almost died. She only cared that I refused to remain the designated sacrifice for her mistakes. Several wealthy donors immediately stood up, grabbed their coats, and walked out of the double doors. The mass exodus had begun. The charity was dead. Her social standing was vaporized. Realizing her entire empire was burning to the ground faster than the lake house, Brooke lunged toward the edge of the stage. Her eyes were completely wild, darting between the disgusted faces of the leaving donors and the cold, unforgiving stare of her husband. "You think you won," Brooke shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. She grasped at the only weapon she had left. "You signed a legal confession. You admitted you burned the house down to the police. You signed the statement. I have it on paper." Reaching into my small black evening bag, I pulled out the folded photocopy I had received on my porch the night before. I walked calmly up the short set of wooden stairs and stepped onto the stage right next to her. I held the paper up directly under the bright stage lights so the remaining board members could see the text. I signed a lie because our father blackmailed me while I was lying in a hospital bed covered in third-degree burns. I replied, my voice perfectly steady and resolute. I turned my head, letting the stage lights illuminate the deep, jagged anchor mark carved into my jaw. And Kenneth was arrogant enough to write his threat down in the margins. Sarah Hayes walked up the stairs behind me. She took the copied document from my hand and placed it gently on the wooden podium right over Brooke's speech notes. The blue ink handwriting was glaringly obvious. Down on the floor, Kenneth collapsed into his chair, holding his head in his hands. Diane sobbed openly, her perfect silver dress stained with dark wine, her social kingdom completely eradicated in less than 5 minutes. Brooke looked down at the paper. Her lips trembled. The air completely left her lungs. She had nothing left to say. There were no more lies to spin. I turned my back on my sister, leaving her standing alone in the ruins of her own making. The grand ballroom of the country club emptied with breathtaking speed. A suffocating silence replaced the thunderous applause of the wealthy donors. The only sounds remaining were the dull clinking of silverware and the squeak of rubber soles as confused catering staff hastily cleared the premium tables. The scent of cold roasted salmon mixed with stale vanilla perfume, creating a nauseating combination. My sister stood entirely alone on the massive wooden stage. Her emerald silk dress looked suddenly absurd, like a costume worn by an actor who forgot the play was over. Brooke stared at the empty chairs, her chest heaving as the reality of her shattered kingdom finally settled over her shoulders. The president of the charity board, A tall man with silver hair and a stern expression marched straight past the stage without offering her a single glance. He approached Sarah Hayes with a rigid professional posture. The man quietly requested copies of every single piece of evidence we had presented. He announced in a cold, echoing voice that the organization was immediately suspending Brookvale from all duties. Every bank account associated with the gala would be frozen by midnight. A complete forensic audit of all received donations was starting first thing Monday morning. My parents remained glued to their seats in the front row. Kenneth stared blankly at the ruined tablecloth. Diane wept silently into her hands, mourning the permanent loss of her social status. They did not reach out to comfort their favorite child. When the illusion of perfection died, the Mercer family had absolutely nothing left to hold them together. Turning away from the wreckage, I walked out of the double mahogany doors into the cool night air. The rain had finally stopped. A clear, sharp breeze swept across the parking lot, filling my lungs with a profound sense of freedom. 16 years of carrying their manufactured guilt simply vanished into the dark sky. The following afternoon, Ethan met me at a quiet coffee shop near the federal district office. Deep purple shadows bruised the skin under his tired eyes, but his shoulders looked remarkably light. He ordered a plain black coffee and slid a signed witness affidavit across the scratched wooden table. His left hand was entirely bare. The gold wedding band that had anchored him to a lie for over a decade was gone. Taking a sip of his coffee, Ethan looked out the foggy window toward the busy street. He explained how he had returned to the sprawling suburban house they shared just long enough to pack 2 large duffel bags. Brooke had been sitting on their living room sofa, completely hysterical, begging him to stay. She tried to spin the evidence one last time, crying about how scared she was when she dropped the sparkler. Ethan simply placed his wedding ring on the marble kitchen counter. He looked his wife in the eyes and told her the absolute truth. He told Brooke he married the story she stole. He walked out the front door without looking back. Hearing those words brought a strange, quiet closure to my own chest. Ethan was no longer a tragic victim in my mind. He was a man taking his own life back. But my work was not entirely finished. The hammer still needed to fall on the woman who forced us into this nightmare. Monday morning arrived with a blinding, harsh sunlight. Sitting inside the polished glass conference room of the law firm, Sarah Hayes presented a massive stack of formal legal documents. This was the civil complaint. It outlined a devastating case for public defamation, intentional infliction of emotional harm, and gross misrepresentation for financial gain. We were not sending my sister to a prison cell. In the circles Brooke operated in, losing your money and your reputation was a far more terrifying punishment. Sarah dispatched a process server to deliver the heavy binder directly to the lake house where Brooke had retreated. The legal trap offered only one exit. If Brooke wanted to avoid a massive, bankrupting trial that would expose every single ugly detail to the national press, she had to accept our settlement terms. We demanded a total surrender. Brooke had to sign a formal, legally binding public correction. She had to confess to the community, the charity board, and our entire extended family that she caused the fire and lied about the rescue. 2 agonized days passed before my office phone rang. The receptionist informed me that 2 visitors were demanding a meeting. Walking into the federal lobby, I found Kenneth and Diane Mercer standing near the security desk. Stripped of their country club arrogance, my parents looked incredibly old and fragile. Diane wore a simple gray sweater, her eyes red and swollen. Kenneth held a rumpled fedora in his trembling hands. They looked at my exposed jawline, unable to meet my eyes for more than a passing second. We moved into a small, sterile visitor room. Kenneth sat down heavily on a plastic chair. He placed his hat on his knees, his voice cracking as he finally spoke. "Please do not do this to our family," my father begged, his tone completely hollow. Brooke agreed to return the money. She agreed to step down from the board and move away. But forcing her to read that correction in public will destroy her entirely. It will humiliate all of us. Do not make your mother and father stand in front of the whole town in disgrace." A cold, diamond-hard resolve settled deep in my chest. I looked at the man who had cornered me in a hospital room when I was 23 years old. I looked at the woman who had closed the ambulance curtain to hide my burned face. "You forced me to stand before this entire town as a criminal," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any pity. "You forced me to carry the blame for a disaster I tried to stop. You traded my future for her comfort. I am not destroying this family. You burned it to the ground 16 years ago. Now, you will simply stand in the ashes and admit what you did." I stood up and left the room, leaving my parents to sit alone with their shame. The final gathering took place on a bleak, overcast Friday afternoon. We chose the exact location where the lie was born. Dozens of folding chairs were arranged across the stone patio of the Mercer Lake House, facing the massive propane tanks. The gray waters of the lake chopped aggressively against the wooden dock. The wind bit through our coats, carrying the distinct smell of approaching winter. 50 people sat in total silence. The charity board of directors, the local bank executives, Claire Bennett, Frank Delaney, and various extended family members filled the seats. Ethan stood near the back edge of the grass, keeping a vast distance between himself and the Mercer family. Brooke walked out of the sliding glass doors wearing a plain, dark dress. She looked completely hollowed out. Her pristine hair was tied back in a messy knot, her face devoid of any makeup. The golden child was gone. A defeated, terrified fraud stood in her place. Sarah Hayes handed Brooke a single sheet of printed paper. It was the legally mandated public correction. Brooke stepped up to a small wooden podium. Her hands shook so violently the paper rattled against the microphone. She looked out at the faces of the people who used to adore her. Now, they stared back with cold, unforgiving judgment. She opened her mouth, choking on the very first word. "Read it," Sarah instructed firmly from the front row. "I am here to correct a long-standing public falsehood," Brooke began, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "In the summer of 2008, I caused the fire that destroyed this property. I carelessly dropped a lit firework near the fuel tanks. I panicked and ran away, leaving my guests trapped inside the burning structure. A harsh gust of wind swept across the patio, rustling the dry winter leaves. Brooke wiped a tear from her cheek, but nobody offered her a tissue. Nobody offered a comforting smile. My sister, Rachel Kane, did not cause the fire," Brooke continued, forcing the words out of her throat like broken glass. "Rachel ran into the blazing house. She pulled Ethan out of the wreckage and suffered severe, permanent burns while saving his life. For 16 years, I knowingly repeated a lie. I stole her heroism to build my own reputation. I deeply apologize for the immense damage my selfishness has caused her." Brooke lowered the paper, sobbing openly into the microphone. There was absolutely no applause. No one stood up to hug her. The profound silence was the heaviest punishment imaginable. Diane wept into her husband's shoulder in the front row, but I did not step forward to comfort my mother. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I simply felt the cool wind blowing against my scarred cheek. The truth had finally been spoken in the very place they tried to bury it. The settlement went into effect immediately. Brooke lost her position, her social standing, and her marriage. She faced years of civil restitution to repay the charity funds. The Mercer family was completely ostracized from the lake community, forced to sell the property and move away in disgrace. They lost the only thing they ever truly cared about, their perfect image. 6 months later, spring brought a warm, welcoming breeze to the Federal Disaster Response Training Center. The smell of fresh pine and damp earth filled the open garage bays. Sunlight poured through the massive bay doors, illuminating rows of heavy rescue equipment and coiled fire hoses. I stood at the front of a large, echoing classroom. 30 young emergency response trainees sat at their metal desks, holding notebooks and waiting for the lecture to begin. I wore my crisp navy blue uniform. My dark hair was tucked securely behind my ears. I made absolutely no effort to hide the jagged anchor mark on my jaw. The scar was no longer a symbol of my failure. It was a living, breathing record of my survival. Before the class officially started, Ethan walked through the open doorway. He wore a heavy canvas jacket, looking healthier and more grounded than he had in over a decade. He carried a small, familiar wooden box in his hands. Approaching my podium, Ethan offered a small, genuine smile. He placed the polished wooden box on the edge of the metal desk. "I am deploying to a new contract zone next week," Ethan said, his voice deep and steady. "I wanted to drop this off before I left. It belongs in an evidence locker, not on my mantle." I looked down at the box containing the melted, twisted navy metal. The heavy metal object that had burned its shape into my flesh was finally closed away in the dark where it belonged. It had served its purpose. It had unlocked the truth. "Thank you, Rachel," Ethan said softly, looking directly into my eyes, "for pulling me out of the dark back then, and for pulling me out of the dark right now. You gave me my life back twice." I offered him a firm, respectful nod, accepting the gratitude I had earned a lifetime ago. "You should have been told the truth from the beginning," I replied. "Safe travels, Ethan." He turned and walked out of the training bay, stepping into the bright morning sunlight. I watched him go, feeling a deep, abiding peace settle over my soul. The past was finally packed away, leaving only the clear, unburdened road ahead. Turning back to face my new class of recruits, I picked up a dry erase marker and stepped toward the massive whiteboard. The young faces stared up at me, eager to learn how to manage chaos and destruction. "Welcome to Advanced Incident Command," I announced, projecting my voice clearly across the large room. "In this line of work, you will face fire, floods, and absolute panic. People will be terrified. They will be desperate to find someone to blame." I tapped the marker against the whiteboard, letting the sharp sound command their total attention. "But your job is to find the facts," I told them, resting my hand briefly over the scarred tissue of my jawline. "You look at the evidence, you follow the damage, and you remember the first, most important rule of standing in the ashes of a disaster. Never let panic rewrite the facts." When you look back at the journey of Rachel Kane, you realize that the most dangerous fires are not the ones that burn down physical houses. The most destructive fires are the lies told by the people who are supposed to protect you. Society often teaches you that family is everything, that blood requires absolute loyalty, and that keeping the peace is the ultimate virtue. But keeping the peace should never require you to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. This story teaches a hard but incredibly necessary lesson about the reality of family dysfunction and the supreme power of undeniable truth. When you find yourself dealing with manipulators, narcissists, or relatives who refuse to take accountability, you will often notice that they are masters of rewriting history. They will twist the facts, change the narrative, and expect you to carry the heavy burden of their mistakes. They will call you difficult, unforgiving, or crazy simply because you refuse to play the role of the quiet scapegoat. But you must remember that your reality is not up for negotiation. A lie does not become the truth just because an entire family agrees to repeat it. You are not obligated to protect the fragile egos of people who would gladly watch your reputation burn to save their own. Healing from a profound betrayal does not mean you have to sweep the ashes under the rug and pretend the damage never happened. People love to push the idea of instant forgiveness, telling you to just let things go for the sake of moving on and avoiding conflict. But true closure does not come from a forced apology or a fake smile at a family barbecue. True closure comes from standing firmly in the light of the facts. It comes from demanding that the record be set straight. Your scars, whether they are physical marks on your skin or invisible wounds on your heart, are the living proof of what you survived. You should never feel ashamed of the wounds you earned while trying to do the right thing. Those marks are the undeniable evidence of your strength, and they are the very things that will eventually expose the people who tried to bury your voice. You hold the power to define your own story. When you rely on solid evidence, emotional control, and absolute patience, you strip manipulators of their only weapon. The truth is incredibly patient. It can wait 16 days or 16 years, but it always rises to the surface to clear your name. Have you ever found yourself playing the scapegoat for a family member who refused to take responsibility for their own destructive actions? Have you ever had to fight to protect your own sanity and reputation when the people closest to you tried to rewrite your reality? It takes immense courage to stop shrinking yourself to fit into a comfortable lie designed by someone else. I would love to hear your personal journey. Share your experiences in the comments below and tell us how you finally found the strength to step out of the shadows, reclaim your truth, and refuse to let manipulation dictate the facts of your beautiful life.